What if I told you the crucifixion had a coded message, hidden in plain sight, waiting 2,000 years to be decoded? Jesus was mocked, beaten, and left to die. But the smallest moments, a glance, a word, a drop of blood, carried meaning the world would only understand centuries later. In this video, we're going to do a complete deep dive into one of the most brutal executions in human history, yet every strike, every word, every breath was fulfilling a plan written centuries before it happened. Everyone knows how Jesus died, but almost no one fully knows what truly happened between those final 6 hours, or why every detail mattered. Though before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? The weight of the cup, agony in Gethsemane. The night air hung heavy over Jerusalem. Beyond the city walls, across the Kidron Valley, an ancient grove of olive trees stood silent. This garden, known as Gethsemane, meaning oil press, would become the stage for one of history's most profound moments of human anguish. Jesus arrived here with his closest followers after celebrating Passover. The meal had been strange, filled with warnings and mysterious words about betrayal and departure. Now, in the darkness, he took Peter, James, and John deeper into the grove. These three had witnessed his greatest moments of glory. Tonight, they would witness his greatest sorrow. The gospel accounts tell us something remarkable happened to Jesus in this garden. He became deeply distressed and troubled. Matthew's gospel uses a Greek word that suggests being surrounded by sorrow. Mark describes him as deeply distressed and troubled. Luke, a physician by training, records that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. This medical detail reveals the severity of his condition. Hematidrosis, as modern medicine calls it, occurs under extreme emotional distress. The tiny capillaries in the sweat glands rupture, mixing blood with perspiration. This rare condition, documented in medical literature, though debated by some scholars, can occur when psychological pressure reaches overwhelming levels. The condition causes the skin to become fragile and sensitive, setting the stage for the physical trauma that would follow. Jesus moved away from the three disciples and fell to the ground. Here we find him praying with an intensity that shook his entire being. The words he spoke reveal the weight pressing down upon him. He asked if it were possible for the cup to pass from him. Yet he added, "Not my will, but yours be done." This cup carried meaning that stretched back through centuries of Jewish scripture. The prophets spoke of God's cup of wrath. Isaiah described it as a vessel containing divine judgment against sin. Jeremiah wrote of nations drinking from this cup and staggering under its effects. Ezekiel painted images of God's fury poured out like wine. More than physical suffering lay ahead. The cup held something far darker. Jesus, who knew no sin, would become sin itself. He would bear the weight of every broken promise, every act of violence, every moment of human darkness throughout all time. The one who existed in perfect communion with the Father would experience separation. The light of the world would enter utter darkness. 3 times he returned to his sleeping disciples. 3 times he found them overcome by exhaustion and grief. He asked them to watch with him for 1 hour. They could not. This failure carries profound meaning. In his moment of greatest need, those closest to him could not stay awake. The loneliness of his mission became complete. An angel appeared to strengthen him, according to Luke's account. Yet the strengthening did not remove the cup. It gave him the ability to drink it. The divine plan would not be altered. What needed to happen would happen. The contrast between Jesus and his disciples reveals something important about human nature and divine purpose. The disciples slept while their master agonized. They could not comprehend what was coming. Their minds could not grasp the cosmic scale of what this night would set in motion. Jesus alone carried the full knowledge of what the cup contained. His prayer shows us both his humanity and his divinity wrestling together. The human part recoiled from the horror ahead. The divine part remained fixed on the purpose. This was not weakness, but the full reality of the incarnation. God had truly become human, experiencing the full weight of human emotion and physical dread. The garden setting itself holds meaning. Gardens appear at crucial moments in the biblical story. Eden was a garden where humanity first fell into sin. Now another garden became the place where the solution began to unfold. Where the first Adam failed, the second Adam would succeed. The oil press that gave Gethsemane its name would find its fulfillment as Jesus himself was pressed and crushed for the sake of others. As the night wore on, the sound of approaching footsteps and torches began to disturb the quiet. The time for prayer had ended. The time for action had arrived. Jesus woke his disciples one final time. He told them to rise, for his betrayer was at hand. The agony in the garden was complete. What came next would test everything they thought they knew about God, power, and the nature of victory itself. The kiss of betrayal, arrest in the moonlight. Torchlight flickered through the ancient olive trees. The peaceful garden transformed into a scene of chaos as a crowd approached. Leading them was one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, whose name would become forever linked with treachery. The crowd consisted of temple guards, Roman soldiers, and representatives from the chief priests and Pharisees. John's gospel tells us they carried lanterns, torches, and weapons. This detail reveals their expectation of resistance. They came prepared for a manhunt, perhaps thinking Jesus would flee into the surrounding hills or that his followers would mount a defense. Judas had arranged a signal with those who sent him. In the dim light, with many people gathered in the garden, identification was necessary. The sign he chose carried bitter irony. A kiss, traditionally a gesture of respect and affection between rabbi and disciple, would mark the target. This intimate act of greeting became the instrument of betrayal. The gospel writers preserve different details about this moment. Matthew records that Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Mark uses a Greek word suggesting an enthusiastic or repeated kissing. Luke adds that Jesus responded with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Understanding Judas requires looking at the fragments the Gospels provide. His surname Iscariot likely means man from Kerioth, a town in Judea. This made him possibly the only Judean among the 12, who were mostly Galileans. He served as the group's treasurer, handling the common purse. John's gospel notes that he helped himself to the money, revealing a character flaw that existed before the final betrayal. What motivated him remains debated. Matthew and Mark mention he went to the chief priests and asked what they would give him to hand Jesus over. The answer was 30 pieces of silver, the price set in Old Testament law for a slave who had been accidentally harmed. Luke and John both state that Satan entered into Judas. These accounts are not contradictory but complementary. Human choice and spiritual influence intertwined in this act. Some scholars suggest Judas may have been trying to force Jesus' hand, believing he would finally reveal his power and overthrow Roman rule. Others point to simple greed or disillusionment. The text does not give us full access to his inner thoughts. What remains clear is that he made a choice, and that choice led to irreversible consequences. As Judas approached Jesus, something unexpected happened. Before the betrayer could complete his act, Jesus stepped forward. John's gospel records him asking the crowd, "Who are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." His response stopped them in their tracks, "I am." These two words in Greek, ego eimi, carry enormous weight. This phrase echoes the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. When God told Moses his name, he said, "I am who I am." Jewish listeners would have recognized this immediately. Jesus was not simply identifying himself, he was making a divine claim. The effect was immediate and physical. John tells us that when Jesus said, "I am," the crowd drew back and fell to the ground. This detail often gets overlooked in retellings of the arrest. Something in those words carried such power that armed men fell backward. For a moment, the divine nature broke through, undeniable and overwhelming. Jesus asked the question again. Again they answered, "They sought Jesus of Nazareth." He told them, "I told you that I am. So if you seek me, let these others go." Even in the moment of his arrest, he protected his followers. This fulfilled his own earlier words that he had not lost any of those given to him. Peter, impulsive and protective, drew a sword. The blade flashed in the torchlight and caught the ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. Blood flowed. Violence erupted. This was the moment of human instinct taking over, the natural response to threat and danger. Jesus' reaction reveals his character. He commanded Peter to put away the sword, saying, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword." Then he did something that no one expected. He touched Malchus's ear and healed him. Luke, the physician, alone records this miracle. In the very moment of his arrest, while being betrayed and seized, Jesus stopped to heal one of his captors. This healing carries profound meaning. Violence would not be answered with violence. The kingdom Jesus proclaimed operated on different principles. Power would manifest not through force, but through sacrificial love. The healed ear of Malchus stands as testimony that Jesus could have called down legions of angels, could have struck his enemies dead, could have walked away untouched. He chose not to. The cup in Gethsemane would be drunk to the dregs. Jesus spoke to the crowd, asking why they came with swords and clubs as if he were a criminal. He had taught daily in the temple courts. They could have arrested him there, yet they came at night in secret, because this was the hour when darkness reigned. The disciples, seeing their master seized and their cause apparently lost, fled into the night. Mark's gospel includes a curious detail about a young man who followed, wearing only a linen garment. When they tried to seize him, he left the garment behind and ran away naked. Many scholars believe this was Mark himself, including this embarrassing detail as an eyewitness mark of authenticity. The garden emptied. The one who had prayed so intensely was now bound and led away. The betrayer had completed his work. The arrest was accomplished. Jerusalem slept, unaware that the night would stretch long before morning came, unaware that the events now set in motion would echo through all of human history. A night of injustice. The trials begin. The bound prisoner moved through Jerusalem's narrow streets. His captors led him first to Annas, father-in-law to Caiaphas, the current high priest. This detail reveals much about power structures in first-century Judea. Annas had served as high priest years earlier, but was deposed by Roman authority. Yet his influence remained strong. 5 of his sons and his son-in-law Caiaphas all held the position. The family controlled temple operations and maintained enormous wealth through the temple tax and the sale of animals for sacrifice. Annas represented old power, the kind that persisted regardless of official titles. Why bring Jesus to Annas first? The text suggests this was an informal, preliminary inquiry. Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. The question aimed to determine if Jesus led a secret society with subversive teachings. Such groups were common in this period. The Romans feared them. The religious establishment feared them. Jesus responded by pointing to the public nature of his ministry. He had taught openly in synagogues and the temple. Nothing was done in secret. This answer frustrated the questioner. One of the officials struck Jesus, demanding more respect when addressing the high priest. Jesus asked a simple question in return. If he spoke wrongly, let them testify to the wrong. If he spoke rightly, why strike him? This exchange set a pattern. Throughout the trials, Jesus would speak sparingly. His silence would be as powerful as his words. He would not defend himself in ways that would satisfy his accusers. The truth needed no defense. It stood on its own. Annas sent Jesus, still bound, to Caiaphas. Here, the full Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, had assembled. This gathering broke multiple rules of Jewish law. The Mishnah, compiled in later centuries but reflecting earlier practice, specified that capital cases could not be tried at night. They could not be tried on the eve of a Sabbath or festival. A verdict could not be reached on the same day as the trial. Yet here they were, in the hours before dawn, conducting a trial that violated their own legal standards. The urgency reveals their fear. They needed this done quickly before the people awoke, before Jesus' supporters could gather, before the momentum could shift. The prosecution brought forward witnesses. Mark tells us their testimony did not agree. This was crucial. Jewish law required 2 or 3 witnesses whose testimony matched exactly. Without this, no conviction was possible. The witnesses contradicted each other. Some claim Jesus said he would destroy the temple made with hands, and in 3 days build another not made with hands. Others told different versions. This charge referenced words Jesus had spoken, but twisted them. John's gospel records that when Jesus cleared the temple courts, he spoke of destroying this temple and raising it in 3 days. He spoke of his body, not the building. The witnesses took his words literally and still could not agree on exactly what he said. Caiaphas grew frustrated. He stood and addressed Jesus directly, demanding he answer the charges. Jesus remained silent. This silence fulfilled ancient prophecy. Isaiah had written of the suffering servant who, like a sheep before its shearers, opens not his mouth. Finally, Caiaphas posed the question that mattered most. He put Jesus under oath, invoking the living God, and demanded to know, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" The moment hung suspended. Everything hinged on the answer. Jesus could have remained silent. He could have given an ambiguous response. Instead, he spoke clearly. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." This response combined multiple layers. The "I am" echoed the divine name again. The reference to the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power quoted Psalm 110, a royal psalm about the Messiah. The coming with clouds referenced Daniel's vision of the Ancient of Days. Jesus was claiming not just messiahship, but divine authority and future vindication. Caiaphas needed nothing more. He tore his robes, a dramatic gesture showing outrage at blasphemy. According to Leviticus, the high priest was forbidden to tear his garments. Yet here he did exactly that. The irony deepens when we remember what his role actually was. As high priest, he should have recognized the Messiah. Instead, he condemned him. The council members agreed. They found Jesus deserving of the ending of life. Yet they lacked the authority to carry out such a sentence. Roman occupation meant Rome-controlled capital punishment. This would require bringing Jesus before the Roman governor. Before dawn broke, they would need a different charge, one that would matter to Roman authorities. While the trial proceeded inside, another drama unfolded in the courtyard. Peter, who had fled the garden, had followed at a distance. He sat among the guards and servants, warming himself by a fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the faces around him. A servant girl looked at Peter and recognized him. "You were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. Peter denied it before them all, claiming he did not know what she was talking about. He moved toward the gateway. Another servant girl saw him and told those standing there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, Peter denied it, this time with an oath. The bystanders approached him. His accent gave him away. "Surely you are one of them," they said. "Your speech makes it obvious." Peter began to curse and swear. He declared he did not know the man. At that moment, a rooster crowed. Peter remembered Jesus' words, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." The sound cut through the night. Peter looked up and saw Jesus being led across the courtyard. Their eyes met. In that glance, Peter saw not anger, but sorrow. He went out and wept bitterly. 2 men, both facing tests, one betrayed with a kiss for 30 pieces of silver, the other denied with curses around a charcoal fire. Both would carry the weight of their choices. The night of injustice had only begun. Morning would bring new trials, new accusers, new false charges in different halls of power. The religious trial was complete. The political trial was about to begin. What is truth? The Roman interrogation. Dawn broke over Jerusalem as the temple authorities led their prisoner toward the fortress. The Antonia Fortress, named after Mark Antony, loomed over the temple complex. From its towers, Roman soldiers watched for any sign of unrest during festivals. Inside, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, held court. The title prefect matters. Archaeological evidence, particularly an inscription found at Caesarea Maritima in 1961, confirms Pilate's exact title. He was not a procurator, as some translations suggest, but a prefect, a military administrator. This distinction helps us understand his priorities. He maintained order. He protected Roman interests. Justice was secondary to stability. Pilate governed from Caesarea, the coastal Roman capital. He came to Jerusalem only during festivals when pilgrims swelled the population and tensions ran high. Passover was particularly volatile. It celebrated Jewish liberation from foreign oppression. The irony of celebrating freedom while under Roman occupation was not lost on anyone. The Jewish leaders faced a problem as they approached Pilate's headquarters. They wanted Jesus executed, but they could not enter a Gentile residence without becoming ceremonially unclean. This would prevent them from eating the Passover meal. So they stood outside while Pilate came out to meet them. The scene captures the absurdity of the situation. Men seeking to end a life while concerned about ritual purity. Pilate asked what charges they brought. Their answer revealed their strategy. They accused Jesus of subverting the nation, opposing payment of taxes to Caesar, and claiming to be Messiah, a king. These charges were political, not religious. Romans did not care about Jewish theological disputes, but sedition, tax resistance, and claiming kingship challenged Roman authority directly. The charges twisted the truth. Jesus had said to give Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God's. He never organized tax resistance, yet the accusers knew how to frame their case for maximum effect. They needed Rome to do what they could not. Pilate took Jesus inside for questioning. The conversation John's Gospel preserves is remarkable. Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus responded with a question, "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me?" This exchange set the tone. Jesus was not on trial. His questioner was. Pilate insisted he was not Jewish and wanted to know what Jesus had done. Jesus explained his kingdom was not of this world. If it were, his servants would fight. His kingdom came from another place. Pilate pressed, "You are a king then?" Jesus affirmed it. He had been born for this purpose, coming into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to him. Pilate's response has echoed through centuries. What is truth? The question was likely cynical. Roman philosophy of this period leaned toward skepticism. Truth was slippery, relative, subject to power and perspective. Yet the question also reveals something profound. Standing before Pilate was truth incarnate. The one who claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life stood silent before this question. The answer was not a proposition, but a person. Pilate returned outside and announced his finding. "I find no basis for a charge against him. This should have ended the matter." The Roman authorities saw no crime. Yet the chief priests and elders persisted. They insisted Jesus stirred up people throughout Judea with his teaching, starting in Galilee and coming all the way here. The mention of Galilee gave Pilate an idea. Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee, happened to be in Jerusalem for the festival. Technically, Jesus fell under Herod's jurisdiction. Perhaps this could become Herod's problem. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, a move that mixed political calculation with an attempt to avoid responsibility. Before following Jesus to Herod's court, we must pause to understand Pilate better. Historical sources beyond the Gospels paint a complex picture. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records multiple incidents showing Pilate's contempt for Jewish sensitivities. He brought Roman military standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem by night, violating Jewish law against graven images. When Jews protested, he threatened violence until their willingness to die forced him to back down. Another incident involved Pilate using temple treasury funds to build an aqueduct. When crowds protested, he had soldiers disguised as civilians beat them with clubs. Philo, a Jewish philosopher contemporary with Jesus, wrote that Pilate's administration was marked by corruption, violence, robberies, assaults, wanton abuse, constant executions without trial, endless savage brutality. Yet, in the gospel accounts, this brutal administrator seems almost reluctant to execute Jesus. He tries multiple times to release him. Some see this as evidence of historical unreliability. Others note that Pilate's position was actually quite precarious. Tiberius, the emperor during this period, was suspicious and brutal toward governors who failed to maintain order. Pilate could not afford a riot, especially not during Passover. The question, what is truth, sits at the heart of this scene. Pilate sought political truth, pragmatic truth, the kind that preserved order and protected his position. Jesus embodied absolute truth, truth that transcends politics and power. The collision between these two types of truth drives the narrative forward. Inside the judgment hall, the Roman concept of justice faced its ultimate test. The legal process called cognitio extra ordinem allowed the governor wide latitude in handling cases. No jury, no strict rules of evidence, no appeals. Pilate's word was final. This made his attempt to avoid deciding all the more significant. He recognized something unusual about this prisoner. The man showed no fear. He spoke with quiet authority. He did not fit the pattern of the rebels and troublemakers Pilate usually dealt with. The gospel writers preserved the theological meaning while maintaining historical plausibility. A Roman governor would not care about Jewish messianic claims, but a Roman governor would care very much about anyone claiming to be a king. The charges were framed precisely to trigger Roman concern while concealing the real religious motivation. As Jesus was led from Pilate's presence toward Herod's court, the morning sun climbed higher. The day of preparation for Passover was underway. In a few hours, priests would begin slaughtering lambs for the festival meal. The timing was not coincidental. The Lamb of God was moving toward his own slaughter. The question of truth would soon be answered not with words, but with blood. The pawn of power, Herod's mocking game. The prisoner arrived at Herod Antipas's Jerusalem residence. This Herod was the son of Herod the Great, the king who had tried to eliminate the infant Jesus by ordering the slaughter of children in Bethlehem. The family's history with this Galilean teacher was already written in blood. Herod Antipas ruled as Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, a title meaning ruler of a fourth part. When his father died, the kingdom was divided among 3 sons and a sister. Antipas received the northern territories. He was not a king, though he desperately wanted the title. This ambition would eventually lead to his downfall when he traveled to Rome to request kingship and instead was exiled by Emperor Caligula. Luke's gospel alone records this episode. Some scholars question its historicity because the other gospels omit it. Yet, the account fits what we know of both Herod's character and the political situation. Herod had long been curious about Jesus. Earlier in Luke's narrative, we learn that Herod wanted to see Jesus because he had heard about him. Some were saying John the Baptist had risen from the dead. This frightened Herod because he had executed John. The execution of John haunted Herod. Mark's gospel provides the backstory. Herod had married Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. This violated Jewish law. John the Baptist publicly condemned the marriage. Herodias wanted John eliminated, but Herod feared him, knowing he was a righteous and holy man. Yet at a birthday celebration, Herodias' daughter danced for Herod. Pleased, he offered her anything, up to half his kingdom. Prompted by her mother, she asked for John's head on a platter. Herod, bound by his oath before his guests, complied. Now another prophet stood before him. Herod's reaction tells us much about his character. He was greatly pleased. He hoped to see Jesus perform a miracle. This was not genuine spiritual curiosity, it was entertainment. Herod treated the divine like a magic show, a performance for his amusement. The Tetrarch questioned Jesus at length. The Greek word Luke uses suggests extensive, detailed questioning. Herod wanted information, stories, explanations. Perhaps he wanted to understand what made this teacher so influential. Perhaps he simply wanted to be diverted from boredom. Jesus gave him nothing, not a word. This silence was different from his silence before Pilate. With Pilate, Jesus engaged in dialogue about truth and kingdoms. With Herod, there was complete silence. This was not the silence of someone protecting himself. It was the silence of judgment. Herod had already rejected the truth when he ended John the Baptist. He would receive nothing more. The chief priests and teachers of the law were present. They stood there, vehemently accusing Jesus. The word vehemently suggests intensity and passion. They wanted Herod to see Jesus as dangerous. They needed him to support their cause. But Herod was uninterested in their religious concerns. Frustrated by Jesus' silence and finding no political threat, Herod and his soldiers turned to mockery. They dressed Jesus in an elegant robe, likely one of Herod's own royal garments. The gesture dripped with contempt. "Here is your king," they seemed to say. "Look at this powerless, silent man claiming authority." The mockery served multiple purposes. It entertained Herod and his court. It showed contempt for Jesus' claims. And crucially, it communicated Herod's verdict. This man is no threat. He is a fool, not a rebel. The elegant robe declared Jesus harmless beneath serious consideration. This assessment was what Pilate needed. When Herod sent Jesus back, the message was clear. Even the Jewish ruler of Galilee found nothing worthy of death in this man. Luke notes that Herod and Pilate became friends that day. Before this, they had been enemies. The reconciliation between these two reveals the political dynamics at play. Herod had resented Pilate's interference in Galilean matters. Pilate saw Herod as a petty local ruler. But now they found common ground. Both wanted to avoid responsibility for Jesus while maintaining their power structures. Pilate had shown Herod respect by referring the case to him, acknowledging his jurisdiction. Herod had supported Pilate by finding no fault in Jesus. Political expedience created friendship where enmity had existed. The elegant robe Jesus wore as he was returned to Pilate becomes a powerful symbol. It was meant to mock, but it spoke truth. This was royalty, though not the kind Herod or Pilate understood. The robe identified Jesus as set apart, different. carrying authority from another source. The mockers intended contempt but created a tableau of truth. Herod's treatment of Jesus reveals a particular kind of spiritual blindness. He had access to truth. John the Baptist had preached to him. Jesus now stood before him. Yet Herod approached both as curiosities, sources of entertainment or annoyance, never as messengers from God demanding response and repentance. His kingdom was built on political calculation, moral compromise, and murderous expedience. He could not recognize the kingdom Jesus embodied because he had already rejected it. The journey back through Jerusalem's streets took Jesus closer to the end. Two powerful men had now examined him. Both found no basis for charges, yet neither would release him. The machinery of injustice, once set in motion, proved difficult to stop. Religious authorities wanted him removed. Political authorities wanted to avoid responsibility. Caught between these forces, Jesus moved toward the next stage. The morning was advancing. The city was waking fully now. Pilgrims filled the streets. The temple courts bustled with activity. People came to purchase their Passover lambs. Soon the governor would present a choice to the crowd. The man in the elegant robe would stand alongside a known rebel. The people would be given power to decide. Democracy, in a twisted form, would determine the fate of the one who came to save. Herod's palace faded behind as the prisoner, mocked and rejected by Jewish authority, returned to face Roman power once more. The elegant robe would soon be replaced with purple, the mockery would intensify, and the question of kingship would be answered not in words, but in wood, nails, and blood. Behold the man, the scourging, and the crowd. Pilate addressed the crowd gathering outside his headquarters. He summarized what had happened. He had examined Jesus and found no basis for the charges. Herod had also examined him and sent him back. Nothing this man had done deserved the ending of his life. The governor proposed a solution. He would punish Jesus and release him. This meant scourging, a brutal practice that often preceded crucifixion, but could also serve as punishment in itself. Pilate seemed to believe that seeing Jesus beaten would satisfy the crowd's anger while allowing him to release an innocent man. What followed was one of history's most savage legal punishments. Roman scourging was designed to bring the victim to the edge of ending. The instrument used was called a flagrum or flagellum. It consisted of a short wooden handle attached to several leather thongs. At the ends of these thongs were pieces of metal, bone, or glass designed to tear flesh. Historical accounts from various sources describe the process. The victim was stripped and bound to a post or pillar with arms extended. Two soldiers, one on each side, would take turns striking the victim's back, buttocks, and legs. Roman law limited citizen scourging to 40 lashes. For non-citizens like Jesus, no such limit existed. The gospel writers do not dwell on the physical details. They simply state that Pilate had Jesus flogged. Yet understanding what this meant helps us grasp the extent of suffering involved. The metal and bone would tear through skin into the subcutaneous tissue and eventually into the muscle. Blood loss was severe. The pain was excruciating. Many did not survive scourging. Medical analysis of crucifixion victims from this period indicates that scourging caused trauma to the chest wall, making breathing difficult. The loss of blood led to shock. The exposed nerve endings created constant, intense pain. When Isaiah prophesied that the Messiah would be marred beyond human likeness, this was part of what he foresaw. After the scourging, the soldiers took Jesus inside the praetorium. The entire cohort gathered around him. What happened next was cruel theater. They twisted together a crown from thorny branches and placed it on his head. They dressed him in a purple robe, mocking royal garments. They put a staff in his right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mock homage. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him. They struck him on the head with the staff, driving the thorns deeper into his scalp. The head contains many blood vessels. Crown wounds would have bled profusely, the blood running down his face. This mockery reveals how the soldiers viewed Jewish messianic hopes. To them, the whole idea of a Jewish king was laughable. Rome ruled the world. Anyone claiming to be king was either a fool or a rebel destined for execution. They could mock with impunity because power was theirs. Pilate brought Jesus out again. John's gospel preserves the moment with particular power. Pilate declared, "Behold the man," in Latin, exe homo. He presented the scourged, bleeding, thorn-crowned figure to the crowd. The governor's calculation was clear. Surely this pitiful sight would satisfy their bloodlust. Surely they would agree that this man had suffered enough. He was wrong. The chief priests and officials shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" The crowd took up the cry. What Pilate intended as a display to evoke pity instead inflamed them to demand more violence. Pilate's frustration showed. "You take him and crucify him," he said. "As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." This was impossible, of course. They lacked the authority. But Pilate's words reveal his desperation. He had beaten an innocent man and still could not satisfy the mob. The Jewish leaders played their trump card. "We have a law," they said, "and according to that law, he must face consequences because he claimed to be the Son of God." This statement changed everything. Pilate, already uneasy, became more afraid. The claim to divine sonship resonated differently in Roman culture than in Jewish culture. Romans believed in demigods, offspring of gods who walked the earth. Could this bleeding man be something more? Pilate took Jesus back inside. He asked a question that betrays his growing fear. "Where do you come from?" Jesus gave no answer. Frustrated, Pilate asserted his power. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus' response cut through the pretense. "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." This exchange reveals the theology underlying the narrative. Human power exists only by divine permission. Pilate thought he controlled the situation. In reality, he was a player in a cosmic drama he did not understand. The real power belonged to the one standing beaten and bloodied before him. From this point, John tells us, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders knew how to manipulate Roman fear. They shouted, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." The phrase "friend of Caesar" was not casual. It carried political weight. Being recognized as a friend of the emperor brought status and protection. Losing that friendship could mean losing everything. The accusation was a threat. "Support this man, and we will report your disloyalty to Rome." Pilate brought Jesus out once more. He sat down on the judge's seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Archaeological discoveries have uncovered ancient stone pavements at locations associated with Roman governance in Jerusalem, though scholars continue to debate the precise site. John's Gospel notes the timing using Roman reckoning, stating it was about the 6th hour, or noon. Mark's Gospel, using the Jewish system of time, places the crucifixion at the 3rd hour. These different timekeeping methods reflect the diverse audiences the Gospel writers addressed. Pilate declared, "Here is your king." The crowd shouted, "Take him away! Crucify him!" Pilate asked, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." This declaration was spiritually devastating. For centuries, Israel had insisted that the Lord alone was their king. Now their religious leaders declared Caesar as their only king. In their desperation to destroy Jesus, they betrayed their most fundamental identity. Yet Pilate had one more option. A custom existed during Passover. The governor would release one prisoner chosen by the crowd. This amnesty was a gesture toward the Jews, acknowledging their festival while demonstrating Roman mercy. Pilate held in custody a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. The Gospel writers describe Barabbas differently. Matthew calls him notorious. Mark and Luke identify him as someone who had committed violent acts during an insurrection. John simply calls him a rebel. His name means son of the Father in Aramaic. Some ancient manuscripts give his full name as Jesus Barabbas, though most translations omit the first name to avoid confusion. The choice Pilate presented carried profound irony. Two men, possibly both named Jesus. One had led armed rebellion against Rome. The other proclaimed a kingdom not of this world. One had taken life, the other came to give life. One represented the path of violence. The other embodied sacrificial love. Pilate asked the crowd which prisoner they wanted released. He clearly expected them to choose Jesus of Nazareth. Matthew's Gospel adds that Pilate knew they had handed Jesus over out of envy. He understood the real motivation behind the charges. While Pilate sat on the judge's seat, his wife sent him an urgent message. "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Dreams held significance in the ancient world. They were often seen as messages from the divine realm. Pilate's wife, whose name tradition gives as Claudia Procula, added her warning to his own misgivings. Yet political pressure proved stronger than these concerns. The chief priests and elders worked through the crowd, persuading them to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus put to an end. When Pilate asked which of the two they wanted released, the crowd shouted, "Barabbas!" Pilate pressed them. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" The response came as a roar, "Crucify him!" Pilate asked what crime he had committed. They shouted louder still, "Crucify him!" The scene reveals mob psychology at its worst. Individuals who might have thought differently were swept up in collective emotion. The religious authorities who wanted Jesus removed provided direction. The crowd, gathered for various reasons, became an instrument of injustice. Pilate saw he was getting nowhere and that a riot was starting. He took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "It is your responsibility." The crowd answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." This hand-washing gesture was Jewish, not Roman. Pilate was performing a ritual from Deuteronomy where elders would wash their hands to declare innocence in an unsolved death. The symbolism was clear but hollow. He could wash his hands, but he could not wash away responsibility. He held the power. His decision would determine the outcome. No ritual could transfer that accountability. The crowd's response, accepting responsibility for Jesus' blood, has been tragically misused throughout history to justify violence against Jewish people. Yet the statement reflects the immediate moment, not a curse extending through generations. Those present took responsibility for their choice. They could not speak for future generations or all Jewish people across time and space. Pilate released Barabbas. He had Jesus flogged again, though already scourged. Then he handed him over to be crucified. The innocent man would suffer the fate meant for the guilty. The guilty man walked free. This exchange embodies the heart of the gospel message. Barabbas received what Jesus deserved. Jesus received what Barabbas deserved. The soldiers took custody of Jesus. The scourging and mocking inside the praetorium now gave way to the public spectacle of crucifixion. Roman justice demanded that punishment be visible. Executions served as deterrents. They showed what happened to those who challenged Roman authority. The march through Jerusalem's streets would place Jesus on display for all to see. The man who had asked, "What is truth?" had made his decision. The crowd that had shouted, "Hosanna!" days earlier when Jesus entered Jerusalem now shouted, "Crucify!" The religious leaders who should have recognized their Messiah had secured his condemnation. The political leader who found no guilt had ordered the execution anyway. Morning had fully arrived. The sun climbed toward its zenith. In the temple courts, priests prepared for the afternoon sacrifice of Passover lambs. Outside Pilate's headquarters, soldiers prepared to lead the Lamb of God toward Golgotha. The choice had been made. The path was set. The journey to the cross would now begin. The road to Golgotha, the Via Dolorosa. The condemned man emerged from the praetorium carrying the instrument of his own execution. Roman procedure required victims to carry the crossbeam, called the patibulum, through the streets to the crucifixion site. This served multiple purposes. It increased the victim's suffering and humiliation. It displayed Roman power to the population. It warned others against similar crimes. The patibulum typically weighed between 75 and 125 pounds. It measured about 6 feet long. How exactly victims carried this burden varied. Some historical accounts suggest the arms were sometimes bound to the beam, though the specific procedures differed based on circumstances and local practice. Jesus had already endured hours of abuse. The scourging alone would have brought him close to the end. Blood loss weakened him. The thorns still pressed into his scalp. His back was shredded. Now he bore this heavy beam through Jerusalem's streets. A sign would have been carried before him or hung around his neck, declaring his crime. This titulus, as Romans called it, let spectators know why this man faced execution. It served as both identification and warning. For Jesus, the charge read, "The King of the Jews," written in multiple languages so all could understand. The route led from Pilate's judgment seat toward the city gate and the execution ground beyond. Tradition identifies this path as the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. The actual route is debated among scholars and archaeologists. Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. The street level in Jesus' day lies buried beneath modern construction. Yet the general direction is known, from the area of Roman governance through the city, out the gate to the place called Golgotha. John's gospel states that Jesus carried his own cross. The other gospels introduce a man named Simon. At some point during the journey, Jesus could no longer bear the weight. Whether he collapsed or simply slowed the procession, the soldiers needed someone else to carry the beam. They conscripted Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene was a city in North Africa, in the region now known as Libya. A significant Jewish community lived there. Simon had come to Jerusalem for Passover, one of thousands of pilgrims. The text identifies him as the father of Alexander and Rufus, suggesting these sons were known to the early Christian community. This detail indicates Simon's encounter with Jesus changed his life. Scholars believe he and his family became followers. Roman soldiers had authority to press civilians into service. The technical term was angaria, the right to requisition property or labor for official purposes. Simon had no choice. He was grabbed from the crowd and forced to carry the beam for this bloodied, stumbling prisoner. Imagine Simon's perspective. He came to celebrate freedom from ancient bondage in Egypt. Instead, he found himself carrying the execution device for a man condemned by his own people and by Rome. The heavy wood pressed against his shoulders. Blood from Jesus' wounds likely stained his clothes. The crowd jeered and watched. Roman soldiers surrounded them. Yet this forced service placed Simon at the center of history's most significant moment. A large crowd followed. Among them were women mourning and wailing. Luke's gospel records that Jesus turned to these women and spoke. His words were not about his own suffering, but about theirs. He told them not to weep for him, but to weep for themselves and for their children. He continued with prophetic warning. Days were coming when people would say, "Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed." This reversed the normal blessing. In that culture, children were considered the ultimate blessing. Yet Jesus foresaw a time when childlessness would seem preferable because of the horror coming upon Jerusalem. He quoted a saying, "If people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" The metaphor referred to innocent suffering. If Rome did this to an innocent man during a time of relative peace, what would happen when judgment fully came upon the guilty nation? This prophecy was fulfilled 40 years later when Rome destroyed Jerusalem, bringing unimaginable suffering. The procession included 2 others. These were described as criminals, men already condemned to crucifixion. The Greek word used suggests they were bandits or rebels, likely part of resistance movements against Rome. They would be executed alongside Jesus, one on each side. This fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy that the Messiah would be numbered with the transgressors. The route covered about 600 yards, though the exact distance depends on which path the soldiers took. For a healthy person, this was a brief walk. For Jesus, carrying the heavy beam in his condition, each step required enormous effort. He had not slept. He had been beaten repeatedly. He had lost significant blood. His body was entering shock. Yet he walked forward, driven by purpose beyond physical endurance. The streets would have been busy. Passover brought Jerusalem's population from its usual size to many times that number as pilgrims filled the city. Estimates vary widely among scholars, but the population swelled dramatically during the festival. People filled every available space. The narrow streets meant the procession moved slowly through crowds. Some mocked, some wept. Most simply watched, another execution among many in occupied territory. Archaeological evidence from crucifixion victims found near Jerusalem reveals the brutal reality. In 1968, workers discovered a tomb containing an ossuary, a bone box with the remains of a man named Yehohanan. His heel bones were still pierced by an iron nail. The nail had hit a knot in the wood and bent, making removal impossible. They buried him with the nail still in place. This grim discovery provides physical evidence of crucifixion's horror. The Romans learned crucifixion from the Carthaginians and perfected it as a means of execution. It was designed for maximum suffering over maximum time. Victims could hang for days before finally succumbing. The pain was so severe that a new word entered language, excruciating, literally meaning out of the cross. Only slaves, rebels, and the worst criminals faced this fate. Roman citizens were exempt, typically facing beheading instead. Crucifixion carried such stigma that polite society did not discuss it. The very word was obscene. Yet this became the method chosen for the one claiming to be the Son of God. As the procession moved through Jerusalem's streets, few understood what was actually happening. To most observers, this was another execution. Rome maintained order through violence. Rebels and criminals died regularly. This bloodied man wearing thorns seemed no different. The soldiers were doing their job. The religious leaders were protecting their authority. The crowd was watching the spectacle that Roman occupation provided. Yet something unprecedented was unfolding. The Creator was carrying the instrument that would pierce him. The judge was walking toward his own execution. The one who spoke galaxies into existence struggled under the weight of a wooden beam. Power was manifesting in weakness. Victory was appearing as defeat. The kingdom was advancing through surrender. The city gate approached. Beyond it lay a rocky hill. Its name meant Place of the Skull. Whether this referred to its shape or its purpose remains debated. Here the vertical posts stood permanently planted, waiting for new crossbeams and new victims. Here Jesus would be lifted up, just as he had predicted. Here the ancient prophecies would converge in wood, iron, and flesh. The Via Dolorosa was nearly complete. The crucifixion was about to begin. The crucifixion, nails, prophecy, and forgiveness. The place called Golgotha rose before them. The Aramaic name meant skull. In Latin, the same place was called Calvaria, from which comes the English word Calvary. Some scholars suggest the hill's shape resembled a skull. Others note that execution sites were often called such because of the many who perished there. The rocky outcrop stood outside the city walls, as Jewish law required. The condemned would be visible from passing roads, a deliberate display of Roman justice. The soldiers offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh. Mark's gospel records this detail. The mixture was a mild narcotic meant to dull pain. This was sometimes provided by wealthy women of Jerusalem as an act of mercy. Jesus tasted it, but refused to drink. He would face what came with full consciousness. The cup his father had given him would be drunk completely. They laid him down on the ground. The crossbeam Simon had carried was positioned beneath his shoulders. The soldiers stretched out his arms along the wood. Then came the nails. Archaeological evidence and historical records indicate nails were driven through the wrists in the space between the bones of the forearm. This location provided structural support. Nails through the palms would tear through flesh under the body's weight. The wrist position, while more secure, severed the median nerve, causing intense shooting pain throughout the arms. The nails were thick iron spikes, typically 5 to 7 inches long. Each blow of the hammer drove them deeper. The sound would have been terrible, the pain beyond description. Yet the gospel writers give minimal detail. They simply state, they crucified him. The horror was too well known to require elaboration. Everyone understood what crucifixion meant. Once the hands were secured, the soldiers lifted the crossbeam and victim together. They hoisted this onto the vertical post already standing at Golgotha. The post had a notch or peg where the crossbeam would rest. Some crosses were shaped like a T, others like a lowercase t. The exact shape varied. What remained constant was the agony of the position. The feet were positioned next. Some evidence suggests a small wooden peg supported part of the body's weight, prolonging life and suffering. The feet were nailed to the vertical beam, sometimes together, sometimes separately. Again, the blow of the hammer, again, the nerve damage and searing pain, again, the minimal gospel description. The facts speak for themselves. John's gospel adds a detail. They crucified him and with him 2 others, one on each side, with Jesus in the middle. The placement mattered. Isaiah had prophesied the suffering servant would be numbered with the transgressors. Here Jesus hung between 2 criminals, identified with humanity's guilt, though bearing none of his own. The method of execution was suffocation, combined with shock and exhaustion. The position made breathing difficult. To inhale, the victim had to push up on his nailed feet, scraping his shredded back against the rough wood. This brought momentary relief to the chest and lungs. Then fatigue would force him down again, causing breathing to become shallow and inadequate. The cycle repeated endlessly. Eventually, the victim could no longer push up. Carbon dioxide built up in the blood, the heart raced, organs began to fail, consciousness faded. Then came the ending. But Jesus was just beginning. The time was 9 in the morning, according to Mark's gospel. He would hang there for 6 hours. As the soldiers finished their work, Jesus spoke his first words from the cross: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This prayer is staggering in its grace. He asked forgiveness for his executioners. The soldiers pounding nails, the religious leaders who demanded his blood, the crowd that chose Barabbas. Pilate, who washed his hands but gave the order. They were ending his life in the most brutal way possible, and his response was to ask his Father to forgive them. The reason he gave reveals profound truth. They do not know what they are doing. This was not excusing their actions, but recognizing their ignorance. They thought they were executing a criminal. They did not understand they were crucifying the Lord of glory. Paul would later write that if they had understood, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Their ignorance was real, though it did not remove responsibility. While Jesus prayed for forgiveness, the soldiers went about their business. They divided his clothes among them, casting lots to see who would get what. John notes this fulfilled prophecy from Psalm 22. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. The soldiers had no knowledge of Scripture. They were simply following standard procedure. Condemned men's possessions belonged to the execution detail. Yet even this mundane act fulfilled ancient words written 1,000 years earlier. The tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Rather than tear it, they cast lots for the whole garment. This detail suggests quality clothing, possibly woven by his mother Mary or a devoted follower. The soldiers gambling for it at the foot of the cross creates a jarring image. Life and death, profound and mundane, sacred and profane, all mixed together in this moment. Above Jesus' head, they placed the charge written against him. Pilate had ordered the sign prepared. It read in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The three languages ensured everyone could read it. Aramaic was the local language. Latin represented Rome. Greek was the common language of the Eastern Empire. The chief priests objected. They went to Pilate asking him to change the wording to "This man claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate refused. "What I have written, he replied. In this small act, Pilate showed a flash of integrity. He would not change the charge. Jesus was identified as king, and that identification would remain. The irony runs deep. The sign meant to mock actually proclaimed truth. Jesus was indeed the King of the Jews, though his kingdom was not what anyone expected. The title hung over his head as he hung dying. Power, kingship, and authority were being redefined before the world's eyes. The king wore a crown of thorns. His throne was an execution device. His royal garments were taken by gamblers. Yet this was kingship in its truest form, rule through sacrificial love rather than coercive power. Passers-by hurled insults at him. They shook their heads and said, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." The religious leaders mocked him too. He saved others, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, "I am the Son of God." These taunts unknowingly spoke truth. He could have come down. He could have called legions of angels. He had the power to save himself. Yet if he did, he could not save others. The very inability they mocked was actually divine strength operating through voluntary restraint. He would not save himself because his purpose was to save others. The king would not abandon his throne because that throne, however unlikely it appeared, was the place where redemption was accomplished. Even the criminals crucified with him joined in the mocking, according to Matthew and Mark. Luke adds nuance to this detail. One criminal hurled insults. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him. "Don't you fear God, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then this criminal turned to Jesus and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." He saw beyond the apparent defeat. He recognized something true about this bloodied man hanging beside him. Jesus responded with the second statement from the cross. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. This exchange reveals the heart of the gospel. The criminal could do nothing to earn salvation. He was nailed to a cross, unable to perform good works or religious rituals. He simply recognized his own guilt, acknowledged Jesus' innocence, and asked to be remembered. Jesus promised him immediate entrance into paradise, grace given to the undeserving, forgiveness extended at the last possible moment, the kingdom opened to those who simply ask. At the foot of the cross stood a group of women. They had followed Jesus from Galilee, supporting his ministry with their own resources. They stayed when the male disciples fled. Mary Magdalene was there, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, Salome, and Jesus' own mother, Mary. John's gospel tells us that John himself, identified as the disciple whom Jesus loved, also stood there. He alone among the 12 remained at the cross. Jesus looked down at his mother and the beloved disciple. He said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." To John he said, "Here is your mother." From that time on, John took Mary into his home. This third statement from the cross shows Jesus' care for his mother even in his agony. Mary had watched her son grow from infancy. She had treasured all the strange events surrounding his birth. She had seen his first miracle at Cana. She had heard people say he was out of his mind. She had stood by, believing. Now she watched him be executed, the sword piercing her soul that Simeon had prophesied when Jesus was just 40 days old. Jesus ensured she would be cared for. He gave her to John, his closest friend. He gave John to her as a son. This was practical provision and spiritual connection, creating family from friendship. Even dying, Jesus fulfilled the law's command to honor father and mother. Even in agony, he thought of others' needs before his own. The morning was giving way to midday. The sun climbed toward its peak. The crowd continued watching. The soldiers sat guarding. The religious leaders felt satisfied. The Roman authorities maintained order. But something was about to happen that would signal this was no ordinary execution. The universe itself was about to respond to what was unfolding on Golgotha's skull-shaped hill. The 7 sayings, words from the cross, 3 of Jesus's. 7 statements from the cross have already been examined. The prayer for forgiveness, the promise to the criminal, the care for his mother. 4 more remained, each one revealing different aspects of his suffering and mission. Together they form a theology spoken through agony, truth proclaimed from an execution device. The 4th saying came at midday. Mark records that from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. This was not night falling early or clouds blocking the sun. The Greek word used suggests an unnatural darkness, something beyond normal meteorological phenomena. Passover occurred during a full moon, making a solar eclipse impossible. Whatever caused the darkness, it was supernatural. In that darkness, unseen by human eyes, something profound was happening. The one who had never known sin was becoming sin. The Father was laying on him the iniquity of us all. The cup of God's wrath was being drunk. This was not divine child abuse, as some have wrongly suggested. This was the Trinity's agreed-upon plan, the Father and Son in perfect unity accomplishing redemption through voluntary sacrifice. Near the end of the 3 hours of darkness, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." Matthew and Mark both preserve these Aramaic words before translating them. My God, why have you forsaken me?" This 4th saying from the cross is perhaps the most mysterious and troubling of all. These words open Psalm 22, a psalm of David written 1,000 years earlier. The psalm begins in anguish but ends in triumph and worship. Jesus was not simply expressing despair but identifying himself with the entire psalm. Yet the words also reveal real abandonment. In that moment, the Father turned his face away. The fellowship that had existed from eternity was broken. This was not emotional distance, but actual separation as Jesus bore sin. Some in the crowd misunderstood. They thought he was calling for Elijah. The names sound similar in Aramaic. Someone ran and filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to him. Others said, "Leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." They still did not understand. Elijah would not come. No rescue would arrive. This was the path chosen before the foundation of the world. The 5th saying came next. John's Gospel records it, "I am thirsty." This brief statement accomplishes multiple purposes. It shows Jesus' full humanity, the body devastated by scourging, blood loss, and hours of crucifixion, experienced the expected result: severe dehydration. The tissues screamed for moisture, the tongue swelled, the throat burned. Jesus acknowledged this physical need. Yet John notes that Jesus said this so that Scripture would be fulfilled. Psalm 69, another messianic psalm, includes the line, "They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst." The wine vinegar offered was the cheap, sour wine that Roman soldiers drank. Someone soaked a sponge in it and lifted it to his lips. He received it, completing another prophetic detail. The sixth saying followed immediately after. John records that when Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." The Greek word is tetelestai, a single word packed with meaning. In that culture, the word had several uses. Servants would say it when completing a task for their master. Merchants would say it when a debt was paid in full. Artists would say it when finishing a painting or sculpture. All these meanings converged in Jesus' use. The task was complete. The debt was paid. The masterpiece was finished, not abandoned or defeated, but accomplished. What he came to do was done. The work of redemption required no additions or improvements. It was finished. This word echoes through theology. Nothing needs to be added to Christ's work. No human effort can improve it. No religious ritual can complete it. No penance can supplement it. It is finished. The full price was paid. The complete sacrifice was offered. The entire work of salvation was accomplished. The seventh and final saying came moments later. Luke records it. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." These words also quote Scripture, this time from Psalm 31. They show a different tone from the fourth saying. The question of abandonment has passed. The darkness has lifted. The fellowship is restored. Jesus addresses God as Father again, not just as God. He voluntarily surrenders his life. No one takes it from him. He lays it down of his own accord. With this, Jesus breathed his last. The Greek phrase suggests he actively released his spirit. Crucifixion victims typically died slowly over many hours or even days. Jesus died in 6 hours. This was unusually fast. Some have suggested this was because of the extreme scourging he endured. Others note the immense spiritual weight he carried. John's gospel says he gave up his spirit, indicating volition. He chose the moment. The seven sayings together form a complete picture. They address different people and reveal different aspects. To his executioners, forgiveness. To the repentant criminal, salvation. To his mother and beloved disciple, family care. To his Father, the cry of abandonment and then the surrender of his spirit. To humanity, acknowledgement of need and declaration of completion. Each one matters. Each one reveals. Throughout church history, these sayings have been meditated upon, preached about, and woven into liturgy. Medieval tradition connected them to the 7 deadly sins, suggesting Christ's words countered each one. Others have seen in them the fullness of human and divine nature displayed. Still others focus on their practical implications for how followers of Jesus should live and die. The sayings also reveal the physical progression of crucifixion. Early on, Jesus could speak in full sentences, praying for forgiveness and promising paradise. As hours passed and breathing became more difficult, the statements grew shorter. The acknowledgement of thirst, the declaration of completion, the final surrender. Each required pushing up on pierced feet, scraping the shredded back against rough wood, drawing painful breath to force words out. Yet he spoke because these words needed to be heard. Standing at a distance, watching all this, were the women who had followed him. They heard some or all of these statements. They saw the progression of suffering. They witnessed the darkness. They heard the final cry. They knew he was gone. The one they had followed, the teacher who had transformed their lives, had breathed his last on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem's walls. But the story was not finished. The universe had more to say about what happened on that skull-shaped hill. The physical world was about to respond to the death of its creator. Signs and wonders were about to declare that this was no ordinary execution. Heaven and earth would testify that something unprecedented had occurred. The supernatural signs, darkness, veil, and earthquake. The moment of Jesus' death unleashed a series of supernatural events. These were not added legends that grew over time. They appear in multiple independent gospel accounts, written within decades of the events. They were public phenomena that could not be dismissed or explained away. The universe responded to the death of the one through whom it was made. The first sign was the darkness already mentioned. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the land. The Greek word used in the Gospels suggests this was more than local. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record it. This detail was written down while eyewitnesses still lived, people who could have corrected false information. Some skeptics have tried to explain the darkness naturally. Solar eclipse is impossible during Passover's full moon. Sandstorms do not create complete darkness and would not last 3 hours. No natural phenomenon fits the description. The early church father Origen, writing in the 3rd century, noted that pagan writers of the time recorded unusual darkness in various regions, though they did not connect it to Jesus' death. The symbolism was profound. The light of the world was being extinguished. The sun, which testified daily to God's power, hid its face as if unable to witness what was happening. Darkness, associated throughout Scripture with judgment, sin, and separation from God, enveloped the land as Jesus bore the world's sin. When he breathed his last and the work was complete, light returned. The second sign occurred in the temple. At the moment Jesus died, the massive curtain separating the holy place from the most holy place tore from top to bottom. This detail matters. The curtain did not tear from bottom to top, as might happen if someone pulled it. It tore from top to bottom, indicating a divine hand. This curtain was no ordinary piece of fabric. Josephus, who served as a priest before becoming a historian, described the temple curtain in his writings. It was 60 feet high and 30 feet wide. Made of thick, twisted linen, it was decorated with blue, purple, and scarlet thread. The design was so heavy that it required multiple priests to manipulate it. Tradition held that this barrier was the width of a man's palm, roughly 4 inches thick. The veil's purpose was to separate sinful humanity from God's holy presence. Only the high priest could pass through it, and only once per year on the Day of Atonement. He would enter carrying blood to make atonement for Israel's sins. Anyone else who entered would face immediate judgment. The barrier was absolute and necessary because humanity in its sinful state could not approach God directly. When Jesus died, that barrier was removed. The way into God's presence was opened. The writer of Hebrews would later explain this at length. Jesus, the great high priest, entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, obtaining eternal redemption. The torn veil demonstrated that his death accomplished what centuries of animal sacrifices could not. The barrier between God and humanity was eliminated. The timing was significant. 3 in the afternoon was the time of the evening sacrifice. Priests would have been in the temple by preparing the lamb. At the moment the Lamb of God died on Golgotha, the curtain tore. Priests witnessed this. They saw the massive veil split impossibly from top to bottom. The symbolism was inescapable. The Old Covenant sacrificial system was rendered obsolete. The third sign was an earthquake. Matthew's Gospel records, the earth shook, the rocks split. Earthquakes were not uncommon in that region. The African and Arabian tectonic plates meet there, creating geological instability. But this quake's timing made it supernatural. It occurred at the precise moment of Jesus' death, a divine punctuation mark on history's most significant moment. The rock's splitting suggests intensity. Archaeological studies of the region show evidence of past seismic activity. Some researchers have attempted to date ancient earthquakes through geological analysis. One study published in 2012 by geologist Jefferson Williams examined sediment deposits in the Dead Sea. They found evidence of 2 major earthquakes in the Jerusalem area during the 1st century. One occurred between 26 and 36 CE, consistent with the Crucifixion's timing. The earthquake's effects extended beyond physical damage. Matthew records something even more remarkable. The tombs broke open. Rock-cut tombs common in Jerusalem area were sealed with large stones. The earthquake's force was sufficient to dislodge these stones, opening the tombs. What happened next stretches human understanding. Matthew continues, "The bodies of many holy people who had fallen asleep were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people." This detail appears only in Matthew's Gospel. It raises more questions than it answers. Who were these holy people? How many were raised? What happened to them afterward? The text provides minimal information. What we can say is this: The resurrection of Jesus was so powerful that it had effects that reached even to those who had already passed. These saints were raised in connection with Jesus' death, but they emerged from the tombs after his resurrection. This suggests Jesus was the first fruits of resurrection, as Paul would later write. His victory over the ending was so complete that it pulled others along with it. The detail about appearing to many people is significant. This was not a private vision or spiritual experience. Multiple people in Jerusalem saw these resurrected individuals. They were public, verifiable witnesses to the supernatural nature of what had occurred. Matthew includes this detail because it was known and could be attested to by his original audience. Some scholars struggle with this passage. It seems almost mythological, harder to accept than Jesus' own resurrection. Yet Matthew presents it as historical fact, not allegory or symbol. The early church preserved this tradition because it testified to the cosmic scope of Jesus' victory. His death and resurrection did not merely affect individuals who believed. It shook creation itself. The centurion and soldiers guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that happened. Matthew records their response, "Surely he was the Son of God." This declaration from a Roman soldier is remarkable. He had supervised countless crucifixions. He knew what death by crucifixion looked like. This was different. The darkness, the earthquake, the way Jesus died, the centurion recognized something beyond his experience. Luke adds detail to the centurion's response. Surely this was a righteous man. Both statements may have been made, first acknowledging Jesus' righteousness and innocence, then declaring his divine nature. For a Roman soldier to confess Jewish monotheistic belief was extraordinary, yet the evidence before him was undeniable. The crowd that had gathered to watch began to disperse. Luke notes they beat their breasts and went away. This gesture indicated grief and recognition of wrong. The spectacle had turned into something else entirely. What began as entertainment or religious satisfaction ended in fear and uncertainty. They had witnessed something that disturbed their assumptions about power, justice, and divine action. The supernatural signs served multiple purposes. They testified to Jesus' identity. They marked the cosmic significance of his death. They demonstrated that heaven and earth acknowledged what was happening. They fulfilled prophecy, as several Old Testament passages spoke of darkness, earthquakes, and cosmic disturbances accompanying the day of the Lord. Amos had prophesied, "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." Joel spoke of the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. These prophecies found fulfillment in the events surrounding Jesus' death. The signs also divided people into groups based on their responses. Some, like the centurion, recognized truth and began to believe. Others, like the crowd beating their breasts, felt grief and uncertainty. Still others, like the religious leaders, likely explained away what they witnessed or ignored it altogether. The same evidence produced different responses based on the heart's condition. For the disciples hiding in fear throughout the city, these signs would later become part of their testimony. When they proclaimed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, they could point to these public events. The darkness was not debatable. The torn veil was witnessed by priests. The earthquake was felt by thousands. The resurrection appearances were seen by many. Their message rested on verifiable historical events, not private mystical experiences. The afternoon was advancing. The day of preparation for Passover was drawing toward evening. Jewish law required that bodies not remain on crosses overnight, especially not on a Sabbath. This particular Sabbath was a high day, coinciding with Passover. The religious leaders wanted the bodies removed before evening. But before the bodies could be taken down, one final act would occur that would fulfill yet another prophecy and provide crucial testimony to Jesus' actual death. It is finished. Death, spear, and burial. The Jewish authorities approached Pilate with a request. The Sabbath was approaching, and this was no ordinary Sabbath. It was the Passover Sabbath, a high holy day. Deuteronomy commanded that bodies executed and hung on trees must not remain overnight. This law ensured dignity for the dead and prevented defilement of the land. The religious leaders, having orchestrated Jesus' execution, now wanted to ensure proper observance of this law. Their request was specific. They asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken. This practice, called crucifixion in Latin, was a brutal but efficient way to hasten death. When the legs were shattered, victims could no longer push themselves up to breathe. They would suffocate within minutes. It was sentence. The soldiers could then remove the bodies before sunset and the beginning of Sabbath. The Roman soldiers came and broke the legs of the two criminals crucified with Jesus. The sound of bone breaking, the screams of agony, the final gasps for air would have been terrible. First one man, then the other. But when they came to Jesus, they found he was already gone. This surprised them. 6 hours was quick for crucifixion. Most victims lasted much longer, yet Jesus had already breathed his last, having chosen the moment to surrender his spirit. One soldier, wanting to be certain, took a spear and thrust it into Jesus' side. John's gospel, written by an eyewitness, records what happened next. A sudden flow of blood and water came out. This detail is medically significant. The separation of blood and water suggests the spear pierced the pericardium, the sac around the heart. Fluid accumulates there during crucifixion due to heart failure. The water came from this pericardial fluid. The blood came from either the heart itself or the great vessels nearby. Modern medical analysis of crucifixion, based on historical accounts and the few physical remains available, confirms this is consistent with death from crucifixion. The massive trauma, blood loss, and cardiac stress can cause pericardial effusion. The spear thrust, intended to verify death, instead provided medical evidence that Jesus had truly perished. John emphasizes this point. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. Why such emphasis? Because within decades of Jesus' death, some were claiming he did not actually pass. Theories emerged that he merely fainted or was drugged. John, who stood at the cross, wanted no doubt. He saw the spear thrust. He saw the blood and water. Jesus was unmistakably gone. This detail also fulfilled prophecy. John notes two Old Testament passages. First, regarding the unbroken legs. Not one of his bones will be broken. This referenced both the Passover lamb, whose bones were not to be broken, and Psalm 34, which said, "The Lord protects all the righteous one's bones." Jesus was the ultimate Passover lamb. His bones remained intact. Second, regarding the piercing, they will look on the one they have pierced. This comes from Zechariah, a prophetic passage about mourning for one who had been pierced. The prophecy would have fuller meaning later, when those who crucified him would look upon him again and mourn. But immediately it testified to the supernatural nature of the events. Details written centuries earlier were fulfilled precisely. As evening approached, a man named Joseph came to Pilate. Joseph was from Arimathea, a town about 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. The Gospels describe him as a rich man, a member of the Sanhedrin, and a disciple of Jesus. Mark adds that he was waiting for the kingdom of God. Luke notes that he had not consented to the council's decision to crucify Jesus. Matthew says he was a disciple but had kept it secret for fear of the Jewish leaders. Joseph's courage at this moment stands out. He had apparently remained silent during the trial, unable or unwilling to stand against the majority. Now, with Jesus gone and all seeming lost, Joseph came forward publicly. He went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. This was a bold act. It identified him as a follower. It risked his reputation, his position on the council, and possibly his safety. Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already gone. He summoned the centurion and asked if this was true. When the centurion confirmed it, Pilate released the body to Joseph. Roman law typically left crucified criminals on crosses to be eaten by birds and wild animals. This was part of the humiliation. But Pilate granted Joseph's request, perhaps moved by lingering doubts about the execution, perhaps simply following protocol for dealing with local customs. John's Gospel adds that Nicodemus accompanied Joseph. Nicodemus had come to Jesus by night earlier in the ministry, asking questions about being born again. He had later spoken up weekly in the Sanhedrin, asking if their law did not require them to hear from someone before judging. Now he too came forward, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. This was an extraordinary amount, fit for royalty. The expense was enormous. Nicodemus was making a statement about who he believed Jesus to be. The two men took Jesus' body down from the cross. This required careful work. The nails had to be removed. The weight had to be supported. The body, stiffened in the crucifixion position, had to be straightened. They wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen cloth. This was Jewish burial custom. The spices served as preservatives and masked the smell of decay. The linen strips bound the body securely. Near Golgotha was a garden. In the garden was a new tomb carved out of rock where no one had yet been laid. Matthew specifies that this was Joseph's own tomb, one he had prepared for himself. He gave it to Jesus. John notes they laid Jesus there because of the Jewish day of preparation and because the tomb was nearby. Time was running short. The Sabbath would begin at sunset. They needed to complete the burial quickly. The location of this tomb is debated by scholars today, with different traditions pointing to various sites in Jerusalem. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee saw where the body was laid. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, watched carefully, noting the location. They wanted to return after the Sabbath with more spices to properly anoint the body. The rushed burial left more to be done. But for now, with the Sabbath approaching, they had to stop. A large stone was rolled across the entrance to the tomb. This was typically a disc-shaped stone that ran in a groove, allowing it to be rolled aside for access, then rolled back to seal the entrance. The stone protected the body from animals and prevented theft. With the stone in place, the tomb was sealed. Jesus' body lay wrapped and still in the darkness. The women left to prepare spices and perfumes for their return. Then they rested, observing the Sabbath according to the commandment. They did not work. They did not travel beyond the permitted distance. They sat in grief, waiting for the Sabbath to end so they could return and complete their final service to the one they had followed. But the story was not over. The religious leaders were not finished. They remembered something Jesus had said, and it troubled them. They would take one more action to ensure this executed prophet stayed buried. Yet all their efforts would prove futile. The tomb would not hold him. The stone would be moved. The grave clothes would be left behind. But that story belongs to Sunday morning. Friday's darkness was complete. The silent Sabbath, grief, and the glimmer of hope. Saturday in Jerusalem passed in eerie quiet. The city observed the Passover Sabbath. Families gathered for the festival meal. They retold the story of liberation from Egypt. They praised God for bringing their ancestors through the Red Sea and into the Promised Land. They celebrated freedom while a man who claimed to be their liberator lay silent in a borrowed tomb. For Jesus' followers, the day was torture. They could not work. They could not travel. They could not even properly mourn. The Sabbath commandment required rest, but their hearts knew no rest. Everything they had believed seemed to have died with Jesus on that Roman cross. The one they thought would redeem the nation had been executed as a criminal. Their hopes lay buried behind a massive stone. Peter's state of mind is hard to imagine. He had denied Jesus 3 times. The last thing Jesus had seen Peter do was curse and swear that he did not know him. Then Jesus was led away to be crucified. Peter had not been at the cross. He had not helped bury the body. Now he sat somewhere in Jerusalem hiding, broken by guilt and grief. The other disciples were scattered and afraid. Thomas, James, Andrew, Philip, the others who had left everything to follow Jesus, now wondered if it had all been a mistake. They had seen miracles. They had heard teaching unlike anything from the rabbis. They had watched Jesus raise the dead. Yet when the moment came, they had run. And now he was gone. Only John had been at the cross. He carried the weight of what he had witnessed, the scourging, the mocking, the nails, the hours of suffering, the final breath. He had taken Mary into his home as Jesus commanded. Now he likely sat with her, both of them grieving, neither able to make sense of what had happened. The women who followed Jesus faced their own anguish. Mary Magdalene, from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons, had found new life in following him. That life now seemed to have ended. Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, had watched another woman's son die brutally. Salome, Joanna, and the others who had supported Jesus' ministry with their own resources now prepared spices for his body. This was all they could do, this final act of devotion to a teacher who would teach no more. Mary, the mother of Jesus, carried perhaps the deepest pain. She had heard Simeon's prophecy when Jesus was 40 days old. A sword will pierce your own soul too. That sword had pierced. She had watched her son, the child she had nursed and raised, be tortured and executed. The angel's words at his birth, "He will reign over Jacob's descendants forever," seemed like a cruel joke. He was gone after only 3 years of public ministry. No throne, no kingdom, no reign. But Mary had always pondered things in her heart. She remembered the angel's visit, the virgin birth, the shepherd's testimony, the wise men's gifts, Simeon's prophecy, the boy in the temple at 12 speaking with such wisdom that teachers were amazed. She had seen the first miracle at Cana. She knew who he was. The pain was real, but somewhere beneath it perhaps was the smallest seed of hope. Perhaps she wondered if the story was truly finished. The religious authorities felt very different emotions. Relief, primarily. Jesus was eliminated. His movement would collapse without him. His followers would scatter and return to their former lives. Within months, this Galilean teacher would be forgotten like so many other failed messiahs. The temple hierarchy was secure. Their authority was unchallenged. Order was restored. Yet even they felt some unease. They remembered Jesus' words about rebuilding the temple in 3 days. They remembered his claims about rising from the dead. Probably they dismissed these as the ravings of a deluded man. But to be safe, they went to Pilate on the Sabbath with a request. Matthew's gospel alone records this. The chief priests and Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate's response dripped with annoyance. "Take a guard. Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how." He gave them Roman soldiers to post at the tomb. These were not temple guards, but trained Roman military personnel. They went and secured the tomb by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. The seal was probably a cord stretched across the stone and secured with clay or wax stamped with Rome's authority. Breaking it would be a crime against the empire. This action, meant to prevent resurrection claims, actually served to authenticate what would happen next. The tomb was officially sealed. Roman soldiers guarded it. No one could access it without their knowledge. When the tomb was found empty, no reasonable person could claim the disciples stole the body. The security measures taken by Jesus' enemies would become evidence for his resurrection. Saturday slowly passed. The sun moved across the sky. The hours dragged. For those who believed in Jesus, the day felt endless. Sabbath rest had never been so difficult. They could not stop thinking about the cross, the mockery, the suffering, the ending. They could not comprehend how God had allowed this to happen. Where was the kingdom they had anticipated? Where was the deliverance they had expected? The disciples likely remembered Jesus' words, though they did not yet understand them. He had said the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. He had said he must be put to death and after 3 days rise again. But they had not grasped the meaning. They had argued about who would be greatest in the kingdom. They had imagined thrones and power. They had not imagined a cross. Now it was too late. The words seemed hollow. The promises seemed broken. The hope seemed lost. Saturday was a day of death and darkness, of questions with no answers, of faith shattered on the rocks of brutal reality. Yet beneath the grief, unknown to the mourners, something was happening. The battle was being fought in realms they could not see. Victory was being won in ways they could not imagine. Jesus had descended into death. The one who was life itself had entered the realm of the dead. Ancient creeds would later speak of him descending to the dead, preaching to spirits in prison, proclaiming victory even in death's domain. The specifics remain mysterious. Scripture pulls back the veil only slightly, but this much is clear. He who had power to lay down his life had power to take it up again. Saturday evening came. The Sabbath ended. 3 stars appeared in the darkening sky, marking the close of the holy day. The women could now complete their preparations. They would rise early Sunday morning and go to the tomb. They would anoint Jesus' body properly. They would pay their final respects. This was all they could do, this last act of love for their teacher. They did not expect resurrection. They expected only to honor a dead body. They wondered among themselves how they would move the massive stone sealing the tomb. They did not know about the Roman guard. They knew only that they wanted to serve Jesus one final time. As Saturday night deepened, the followers of Jesus tried to sleep. Some probably could not. They lay awake, replaying the events of Friday, the betrayal, the trials, the crucifixion, the death, the burial. Each moment was seared into their memory. How would they go on? What would they do now? The questions had no answers. In the silence of Saturday night, the universe held its breath. The forces of darkness thought they had won. The tomb was sealed. The body was guarded. The movement was crushed. The threat was eliminated. They did not understand that Saturday was not the end, but the pause between defeat and victory, between death and life, between ending and beginning. Soon dawn would break on Sunday. The women would walk to the tomb carrying their spices. They would find something they never expected. The guards would flee in terror. The stone would be moved. The tomb would be empty. The grave clothes would lie where the body had been, but the body itself would be gone. And a young man in white would ask them the most important question in history. Why do you look for the living among the dead? But that was Sunday's story. Saturday was for grief, for questions, for silence. Saturday was for sitting in the darkness and waiting. Saturday was for the death of hope before hope could be reborn in a form no one anticipated. The silent Sabbath was necessary. Without Saturday, Sunday's joy would be diminished. Without the tomb, the resurrection would mean less. Without the depth of despair, the height of victory could not be fully grasped. The followers of Jesus did not yet know that Saturday was not the end, but the bridge. They did not know that grief would turn to joy, fear to courage, death to life. They did not know that everything Jesus had said would prove true, that every promise would be kept, that the kingdom would come, though not in the way they imagined. They would learn these things when the first light of Sunday morning touched the horizon and transformed everything they thought they knew about God, power, and the nature of victory itself.